The causes and prelude to World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history, erupted in 1939, engulfing the world in violence, destruction, and unimaginable suffering. The war, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, fundamentally reshaped the global order and left lasting scars on countless nations. To understand how this cataclysm came to be, it's essential to examine the underlying causes that set the stage for such a massive conflict. The roots of World War II can be traced back to the aftermath of World War I, 1914 to 1918, a conflict that had already shaken Europe to its core. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended World War I but laid the groundwork for future hostilities. The treaty imposed heavy reparations and territorial losses on Germany, which many Germans felt were unjust and humiliating. The economic strain and national humiliation contributed to the rise of radical political movements, including Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. The interwar period was marked by economic instability, particularly the Great Depression of the 1930s, which further destabilized many countries. As economies collapsed, political extremism gained traction, especially in Germany, Italy, and Japan. These nations, driven by a desire for expansion and a sense of grievance, began to challenge the post-World War I international order. In Germany, Hitler rose to power in 1933, promoting a vision of national revival, racial superiority, and territorial expansion. He capitalized on the deep resentment over the Versailles Treaty and the economic hardships of the Great Depression. Hitler's ambitions were clear: to overturn the existing international order, restore Germany's dominance in Europe, and create a vast empire that would ensure the supremacy of the Aryan race. His aggressive foreign policy would soon bring the world to the brink of war. Italy, under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, also pursued expansionist aims. Mussolini sought to recreate the Roman Empire by expanding Italian territory in Africa and Europe. The early years of World War II, the initial phase of World War II, was dominated by the rapid expansion of Axis control across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 introduced the world to a new form of warfare known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This military tactic relied on fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and infantry to overwhelm the enemy quickly, creating chaos and confusion. Within weeks, Poland fell, and its territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, which had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in August 1939. Following the conquest of Poland, a period of relative calm settled over Europe, often referred to as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg. However, in April 1940, Hitler launched a new series of offensives. Germany quickly overran Denmark and Norway, securing access to vital resources and strategic bases. In May 1940, the Nazis unleashed their Blitzkrieg on Western Europe, targeting Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. The fall of France was a shocking and devastating blow to the Allies. France, considered one of the world's major military powers, crumbled under the relentless German assault. The German army bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by invading through the Ardennes Forest, a region the French had believed was impassable for tanks. The French forces, along with British troops, were overwhelmed. In June 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany, and Adolf Hitler famously toured Paris, reveling in his triumph. France was divided into an occupied zone in the north and a puppet regime, known as Vichy France, in the south. With France under German control, Britain stood alone as the last major power fighting against the Axis in Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain in May 1940, became the symbol of British resistance. In a series of stirring speeches, Churchill vowed to continue the fight, famously declaring that Britain would never surrender. The summer of 1940 saw the Battle of Britain, an intense air campaign waged by the German Luftwaffe against Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF. Hitler hoped to achieve air superiority as a prelude to a full-scale invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. However, the RAF, aided by the development of radar technology and the heroism of its pilots, managed to repel the Luftwaffe. The failure of the Battle of Britain marked Hitler's first major defeat in the war, and it forced him to abandon his plans to invade Britain. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Hitler was planning an even more ambitious campaign, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers. Hitler's goal was to destroy the Soviet Union and seize its vast resources, particularly the oil fields of the Caucasus. At first, the Nazis made rapid gains, capturing vast territories and encircling Soviet forces. However, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, refused to collapse. The harsh Russian winter, combined with fierce Soviet resistance, bogged down the German advance. By the end of 1941, the German army was stalled outside Moscow, and Hitler's dream of a quick victory over the Soviet Union began to fade. Turning points and the Allied counteroffensive, the victory in North Africa was a crucial turning point for the Allies, as it opened the door to the invasion of Southern Europe. In July 1943, the Allies launched an invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, marking the beginning of their campaign to liberate Italy from Axis control. The success in Sicily led to the overthrow of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who was arrested by order of King Victor Emmanuel III. Although Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, German forces quickly moved to occupy much of the country, leading to a prolonged and bitter fight as the Allies advanced northward through Italy. Meanwhile, the war in the Pacific was also shifting in favor of the Allies. Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had rapidly expanded its empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, conquering territories from the Philippines to Burma. However, in June 1942, the United States scored a decisive victory in the Battle of Midway. This battle marked the turning point in the Pacific theater, as U.S. forces, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese Navy, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and halting Japan's momentum. From this point forward, the Allies would go on the offensive in the Pacific, engaging in a brutal island-hopping campaign to reclaim territory from the Japanese. As the war progressed, the Allies began coordinating large-scale efforts on multiple fronts. In 1944, the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe, codenamed Operation Overlord, took place. On June 6, 1944, a day known as D-Day, Allied forces, composed of American, British, Canadian, and other troops, landed on the beaches of Normandy in Nazi-occupied France. The invasion was one of the largest amphibious assaults in history and marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Despite fierce German resistance, the Allies secured a foothold in Normandy and began pushing inland, liberating Paris in August 1944. The success of the Normandy invasion was a massive blow to Hitler, as it forced Germany to fight a two-front war, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and the Western Allies closing in from the west. By the fall of 1944, the Allies had liberated much of France and were advancing toward the German border. The fall of the Axis powers and the end of World War II as 1944 drew to a close, it was clear that the Axis powers were on the verge of collapse. In the Pacific, American forces were continuing their island-hopping campaign, securing victories in key battles such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which effectively destroyed Japan's naval capabilities. The relentless U.S. bombing of Japanese cities and infrastructure, combined with the steady advance of Allied troops, brought Japan closer to defeat. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was pushing the Germans back with incredible force. By early 1945, Soviet troops had retaken much of Eastern Europe and were advancing into Germany itself. The Red Army's final objective was the capture of Berlin, the Nazi capital. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945 and advanced into Germany. The situation for the Third Reich was increasingly dire, with German cities being bombed relentlessly by Allied air forces and German troops suffering heavy casualties. In April 1945, Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River, effectively splitting what remained of Nazi Germany in two. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops closing in on his underground bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, marking the symbolic end of the Nazi regime. A week later, on May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. Victory in Europe Day, V-Day, was declared on May 8, 1945, bringing an end to the war in Europe. While the war in Europe had concluded, the conflict in the Pacific was still raging. Japan, despite being on the brink of collapse, refused to surrender. The U.S. military prepared for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, but the invasion was expected to result in enormous casualties for both sides. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands and destroying much of the city. A second bomb hit Nagasaki 3 days later, leading to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, and bringing World War II to a swift and controversial end. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction caused by the atomic bombs, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, forced the Japanese government to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and the formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. This day became known as Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day, officially marking the end of World War II. The aftermath of World War II was profound. The conflict had resulted in the deaths of an estimated 70 to 85 million people, including millions of civilians who perished in bombings, the Holocaust, and other atrocities. Europe and much of Asia lay in ruins, and the global balance of power had shifted dramatically.